I'm James Tremopoulos. I'm the Associate Dean, and I have the great pleasure this afternoon of introducing my colleague, Professor Dayna Scott, who really requires no introduction. She's well known to all of us here in the Osgoode and York community. She joined Osgoode in 2006, the very same year that I joined Osgoode. We were actually hired together after completing a fellowship at McGill. She does extraordinarily interesting and interdisciplinary work. She's cross-appointed to the Faculty of Environmental Studies, and the paper that she's going to be presenting today is a great example of Dayna's innovative scholarship. The talk, entitled Getting Our Fix, Fossil Capitalism and the Implications of New Pipeline Proposals for Environmental Justice in Canada. It's a mouthful, but
Sorry.
But it tells you everything you really need to know, right? And it covers all the bases in terms of what we're going to be hearing about. So you don't want to hear me drone on. Without any further delay, Dayna Scott.
Thanks, James. And I also wanted to say thank you to Poonam and Jody Ann, who's leaving as I'm saying that. And also just generally for the Osgoode Research Fellowship, which I had last year, which gave me some time to really focus in on and decide what I thought were my main conclusions arising out of a 3-year project that I did in partnership with the Amdanang First Nations Health and Environment Committee. That project was called Situating Sarnia Unimagined Communities in the National Energy Debate. And it's finished now. But as I was completing that one, it occurred to me that there was some important insights from the critical geography literature that I thought could shed some light on the broader pipeline debates as they're now playing out in Canada. So this is basically my sort of trial run of that idea. So it's a good time for me to get some feedback and check in with people to see if you think it is, in fact, a productive lens. So we all witness now the jockeying that's going on as different energy interests are trying to secure certain pipeline routes out of the tar sands in advance of their competitors. The stakes are very high, as Alison Redford has learned. Expansion in the tar sands has resulted in a glut of oil stranded inland that's trading at a huge differential when compared to world oil prices. Alberta's selling at a discount, essentially, because of their failure to reach what they call tidewater. In the game of building pipelines, it is now, as it was a century ago, literally a race to the sea. This gives rise to the sense that the decisions we're currently contemplating in Canada, which are very large infrastructure projects, even though they're being described in broad nation-building terms, are being determined without any overarching national strategy or regulatory framework. The key insight that the critical geography literature can bring to this is that pipelines are fixed in place. They're durable structures of concrete and steel, so they create a path dependence in a literal sense. This means that the routes we choose have lasting consequences. They cement certain interests over others over time. For their critics, the most significant effect is the retrenchment of the infrastructure of fossil capitalism, the sense of inevitability with respect to expansion in the tar sands that their construction entails, and the realization that we constrain the ability of future governments and future generations to choose a different energy path. David Harvey's notion of the spatial fix leads to the further insight that the pipelines, as spatially organized fixes to the problems of overaccumulation in the tar sands, are also ultimately temporary. There will be end-arounds, as we're seeing currently with the transport of oil by rail, and even these fixes are suddenly vulnerable as infrastructure becomes the target of idle no more. So a generation of activists frustrated with their disenfranchisement in the current sharing of risks and benefits over resource extraction, and with the lack of a regulatory framework within which their claims could legitimately be heard, will shape the flow of resources across the country in coming years. I want to start with 3 short stories, which are all true. The first one is that late last year, there were representatives of the Communications, Energy, and Paper Workers Union, the CEP, on hand to greet the announcement by Suncor Energy that it would spend $50 million to prepare its Montreal refinery to receive Western crudes. This is the plan that would require the reversal of Enbridge's Line 9 pipeline between Sarnia and Montreal. The CEP had also been seen and heard at rallies opposing the Northern Gateway pipeline. They're members of the Blue-Green Alliance, the alliance apparently bridging the labor and environmental issues facing the country. Both of these are tar sands pipelines. But the CEP, which also represents many workers in the tar sands, in this case adopts a nationalist strategy of fighting to keep oil industry jobs in Canada by invoking the language of Canadian energy security. And the CEP, in doing so, joins what's now a very large chorus of voices, current and former premiers, ambassadors, cabinet ministers, mayors, all calling for increased bitumen upgrading and processing in Canada and a coast-to-coast system of crude oil pipelines to get this product to market. My second story. Oh, is that the one I want? What did I do? Oh, there it is. Okay. Just before the new year, Sarnia's chief of police, Phil Nelson, faced contempt charges. They stemmed from his refusal to dismantle a blockade of the CN rail line crossing the Aamjiwnaang First Nation Reserve. The blockade began on December 21st and extended for 13 days. The aim, inspired by Idle No More, was to shut down Chemical Valley. CN transports an average of 450 cars daily, 7 days a week on this line. The materials include plastics, ethylene, polyethylene, butane, propane, ammonium nitrate, etc. It is the raw materials and finished products that are tied to the petrochemical cluster there. Within days, chemical manufacturing plants in Sarnia were starved for inputs, and the Canadian Propane Association was warning of fuel shortages for home heating across eastern Canada. Sarnia's longtime mayor, Mike Bradley, who is a good union guy with a good relationship with the local First Nation, asked incredulously in the media, "Have we not learned the lessons of Oka and Ipperwash?" Saying he would not order the police to bring down the blockade by force, he suggested that the company deal with the First Nation directly, or with the federal government with whom the First Nation had issues. He preferred to stay out of it. The company did not go to the band or the government. The company went back to the courts. The court responded with contempt charges against Nelson and the blockade spokesperson, and a further injunction, this time enforceable by the OPP. My third story is from last May, when Haudenosaunee activists disrupted NEB hearings on a pipeline application in Ontario using the people's mic technique popularized by the Occupy movement. Members of the local Six Nations community claimed a right to free, prior, and informed consent in relation to the pipeline plans. They said, and I quote, "The people believe the NEB hearings are illegitimate, inaccessible, and undemocratic." They announced the end of the official hearing as members of the board and lawyers for Enbridge left the room through the same back door. The Haudenosaunee then commenced what they called the people's hearing. The NEB responded by closing its doors to all but registered parties and interveners and resuming the official hearing later in the day, with the protests continuing outside. The applause following the speeches of the Haudenosaunee activists is audible even in the text of the official hearing transcript, but the voices of the Haudenosaunee are not heard by the NEB, and their claims are completely absent from the ruling. So what I've been trying to do over the past several months is to find a lens that can illuminate both the global context for these dynamics as well as their particular local effects. And as I said, I'm picking up a little bit on critical geography literature to try to decide if it's a productive lens for figuring out the current pipeline debates and the way they're sort of persisting in Canada. Ultimately, what I want to argue is that building a coast-to-coast pipeline that will deliver Western tar sands crude to Eastern refineries establishes a spatial fix that cements our reliance on fossil fuels in a way that's dismissive of the rights and well-being of future generations, at the same time as it exacerbates existing environmental injustice in Canada. In the end, it's not surprising that these downstream impacts are not part of the mainstream debate, because, as I try to show, there is no regulatory framework in Canada to assess or weigh them. The essential starting point from the critical geography literature on networked infrastructures is that major infrastructure networks decisions such as the decision to build a pipeline, as well as the specific route chosen, have distributive consequences. These consequences include not only the economic benefits, such as the provision of jobs or resource revenues, those that are dominating the national debate, but also environmental health costs. So pipelines do more than carry crude to market, they carry crude to refineries, and refineries produce emissions of harmful air contaminants devastating for downstream communities. So the routes we choose for the pipelines have real consequences for the spatial organization of environmental inequities. The analysis reveals that we can expect environmental health impacts on downstream communities at the end of the pipe, whether it ends in the US Gulf Coast, affecting the poor black neighborhoods of Port Arthur, Texas, as per the Keystone Plan, or the working class neighborhoods of Montreal's East End or St. John's Champlain Heights, as per the Line 9 reversal, or whether it is instead the end of the pipe in a metaphorical sense, meaning a port unloading tar sands crude from a tanker that was loaded in Kitimat, BC, and is headed for a super refinery of China or India, as per the Northern Gateway. My focus is on the everyday chronic pollution that inevitably comes with the refining of dirty oil. This is completely separate from the greenhouse gas emissions that are tied to the extraction of tar sands crude. In other words, I'm not concerned in this project with climate change. It's not that I deny the uneven distribution of climate impacts across the globe or the obvious intergenerational equity problem associated with climate change. It's simply that in treating the question of tar sands expansion only as a global issue, we miss the very local impacts that these big picture energy infrastructure projects are having on particular places and peoples. Okay, so I'm going to develop the argument in three parts. First, I'm going to review very briefly the literature and networked infrastructures and David Harvey's idea of the spatial fix. Then I'm going to outline for you the major pipeline proposals that are on the table in Canada and talk very briefly about the potential environmental justice implications. And then I want to return to the literature in critical geography to explore the multiple meanings of Harvey's spatial fix in more detail and the contradictions that those meanings expose in terms of a coast-to-coast pipeline. Okay, so at the very basic level, the global cities literature conceptualizes global cities like Toronto or Chicago as consisting of a central core and a marginalized periphery. Increasingly, though, more attention is being paid in critical geography to the relationships of interdependence between core and periphery. And often these interconnections are studied by focusing on networked infrastructures conceived in terms of metabolism. The metabolic processes materialize in water, sewer, or energy networks. They're piped, connected in a series of often invisible articulations. The networked infrastructure accordingly mediates the resource flows. In essence, the literature adopts a conception of the oil that travels in the pipelines as constituting material flows of commodified nature, labor power, technology, capital investment, and social relations. It's a conception that invokes the dynamism of living systems, and yet at the same time, it emphasizes that built infrastructure, particularly energy pipelines, are fixed, durable physical structures that determine the routes of resource flows over time. The conception of oil as a material flow of commodified nature flies in the face of the logic of fossil capitalism, under which accumulation and growth are seen to be released from nature's limitations. In fact, several scholars have noted the basic congruence between the physical properties of oil and the socioeconomic and political logics of capitalist development. Elmar Altvater and Timothy Mitchell, the author of Carbon Democracy, both emphasize the importance of paying attention to the material qualities of oil itself. In other words, oil flows. This means, in Altvater's analysis, that the patterns of production and consumption can change freely. But his assertion that it is, quote, simple to transport energy resources to any place in the world is in many respects belied by the current situation in Canada, right? Not only does nature exert some resistance to this, the terrain that lies between the bitumen in situ and the ports in Kitimat is foreboding, But now the political resistance of Indigenous peoples to the proposed Northern Gateway leads most commentators to admit that in this case, the transport of energy resources is anything but simple. Still, I think Altvader's basic point holds, and that is a key aspect of fossil capitalism is the flexibility that it provides in regards to the temporal distribution and spatial location of both production and consumption. The central insight of this literature that's relevant today is David Harvey's notion of the spatial fix. Here, Harvey notes the tendency of natural resource economies to become spatially locked into a specific configuration of infrastructure because of the inflexibility of the invested capital. The dynamic tends to exacerbate the sense of irreversibility of our infrastructure choices as further resources are sunk into technologies of fossil fuel extraction, refining, and export. The final point from this literature, in thinking about crude oil pipelines as networked infrastructure, the notion of connectivity is crucial. Those of us living in cities benefit tremendously from this elaborate system of largely hidden interconnections, and we, to a certain degree, are sheltered from its environmental costs. The price we pay for this connectivity as a society is borne elsewhere, on the periphery. I chose the phrase getting our fix to invoke a sense of addiction or dependency in terms of our relation to hydrocarbons. In Canada, fossil capitalism has proceeded since the last great pipeline debates according to a basic export orientation rooted in the first free trade agreement with the United States and cemented by the proportionality guarantees in the NAFTA. In the early 1990s, a national task force on oil sands strategies instituted several federal tax measures that have been used to support fossil fuel development in the West, and this has been coupled with very strong federal support for international investment in the tar sands, which is continuing to the present day. As my colleague Mark Winfield has noted, however, there are some new elements to the contemporary modes of fossil capitalism, and they include the withdrawal of our commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, the significant streamlining of environmental assessment regimes under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and now the Fisheries Act, and the search for markets beyond the US. The diversification of markets justification for new pipelines, in fact, became even more pronounced as 2012 progressed, fueled by the International Energy Agency's finding that the US would become a top oil producer by the end of the decade and in fact would eventually achieve energy self-sufficiency. So the return of the great pipeline debate is defining Canadian politics, consuming us, crowding newspaper headlines, shaping leadership races, reigniting Indigenous resistance movements, dividing unions. The spotlight, now that Nebraska has approved TransCanada's new route, is back on President Obama. For their part, the federal Conservatives have let the energy companies occupy headlines in recent months after having put pipelines front and center in their 2012 budget. The leaders of the major political parties have fallen into line one by one, each now supporting the movement of oil from Alberta east in broad nation-building rhetoric. So pipelines for now are front page news. They're everywhere around us. But once a pipeline is completed, as the literature on networked infrastructures emphasizes, it literally vanishes underground. Once buried, the critical social relationships and power mechanisms become blurred. Okay, I'm going to talk you very briefly through this map now. Enbridge built the first big piece of pipeline infrastructure in Canada, the interprovincial, which goes from Edmonton through some US states towards Sarnia. In 1976, it was extended to Montreal. Then in the early 1990s, the flow was reversed as the imported light crudes became more economical for Sarnia to refine than the Western crudes. The Kinder Morgan Express travels from Edmonton to Vancouver, and the, what's that one called? Sorry, that's the Trans Mountain, and the Kinder Morgan Express is this one which goes into the US Midwest. The Keystone is the red one, and the Keystone XL, expanded capacity for the US market, is the one marked there. There's a certain sense of urgency tied to these contemporary debates, and that is this idea that we need to find an outlet for the crude that's being produced in the tar sands at an increasing rate. The inability of the tar sands producers to get this oil to new markets via pipelines to the tidewater, where it would be loaded onto tankers for export, means that Western Canadian crudes, as I said, are trading at a deep discount in relation to world oil prices. The bottleneck in the US Midwest, in through here, is causing the producers to be losing up to $50 million a day, they say. The Alberta government says that the price spread means that they are foregoing up to $8.5 million a day in royalties, and is responsible for the nearly $6 billion deficit that Alberta is suddenly facing as a result of bad projections of oil prices over the last year. Until recently, the moniker dirty oil was the opposition's best tool and favored tactic, and I won't rehearse why here. But instead of slowing production to take account of these environmental impacts, all indications are that the federal and Alberta governments intend to plow ahead. According to most projections, current tar sands production of approximately 1.7 million barrels a day will double by 2020 and could reach 4 million barrels a day by 2025. The trouble with all of this, of course, is that Canadian refineries are not currently capable of refining or processing bitumen produced in the tar sands. So for this reason, most of it has to be sent to the US Gulf Coast for refining, but this situation is changing rapidly. So in terms of the race to the tidewater, there are at least three major proposals on the table. As I said, the Keystone, which is TransCanada's attempt to take crude from the tar sands south through the US Midwest and onto the cluster of refineries, which is in Louisiana and the Texas Gulf Coast. The Northern Gateway, going from Edmonton to Kitimat, is currently before a joint review panel of the National Energy Board. The plan is for 225 tankers annually to transport the crude across the Pacific for refining in Asia, assuming it gets from Edmonton through the mountains and the Great Bear Rainforest safely to Kitimat. And then the third route, of course, is the Line 9 re-reversal. So as I said, crude, until very recently, traveling from Montreal towards Sarnia's refineries. And the proposal now is to change the direction of that line. The prospect of bitumen traveling east by pipeline is eagerly received in many camps. In fact, high-profile proponents like former New Brunswick Premier Frank McKenna are capitalizing on the difficulties of getting to Western ports to support their projects. In a press release announcing the CEP's participation in anti-pipeline demonstrations in Vancouver, National President Dave Coles was quoted as saying, quote, "We cannot continue to build new pipelines just to export raw bitumen overseas while leaving our own communities with no jobs or means to prosper. We believe that Canada needs to focus on jobs that treat crude oil here in this country instead of rushing to grow our unrefined oil export capacity." And several companies in Canada do intend to increase their capacity for processing tar sands crude in the coming years, with billions of dollars of upgraders planned for Alberta's heartland and other industrial centers like Sarnia, Montreal, and St. John. This would be a significant change from the present situation. So I've dove into a little bit the StatsCan data in terms of the refining over the past few years. In 2011, Atlantic Canada refineries relied exclusively on imported light crudes. No Western crude was processed there, none was received by pipeline, and none was bitumen. In Quebec in 2011, only a very small proportion of crude was received from Western sources, even though half was received by pipeline. There's some missing. There's a pipeline that comes from Portland here, so that would be imported crudes coming into Montreal. And no bitumen was received. The situation in Sarnia is a little different, of course. Close to all of the crude oil refined there is received by pipeline. About 84% is already coming from the western provinces, and the remainder was coming through Line 9 from Montreal. Most of the crude is still derived from conventional sources, but at least 20% of the feedstock that was received in 2011 was in the form of crude bitumen or oil derived from upgrading bitumen. In Sarnia, this proportion is increasing, and it's forecasted to be as high as 80% by 2015. The linchpin in the plan, of course, is the reversal of Enbridge's Line 9, that portion of the interprovincial that travels between Montreal and Sarnia. As its proponents note, the virtue of this plan is that most of the pipe is already in place. Its repurposing would allow Western crude to be brought all the way to Quebec, supplying a number of refineries along the way. From there, it could link up with the Portland-Montreal pipeline and overseas exports, and with the addition of another pipeline from Montreal towards St. John, the big Irving refinery in New Brunswick could be supplied. So where we are at from a regulatory standpoint, the first hurdle for this pipeline was cleared last July. The National Energy Board gave approval for the reversal of what Enbridge was calling Phase 1, which goes from Sarnia to Hamilton. And they completed the environmental assessment of that project as a standalone project, even though Enbridge had indicated its intention to apply for the reversal of the remainder of the line before the NEB even delivered its ruling on Phase 1. The application was opposed by the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, who fear that the heavier Western crudes will lead to more and more deadly air emissions from the refineries that circle the reserve. And it was also opposed by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who fear that a spill of diluted bitumen on their traditional territory would poison sacred lands and waters. Phase 2 of the reversal is currently before the NEB. So I've been focusing in this project on an environmental justice framework which is concerned with the distribution of risks and benefits relating to the environment. The movement, of course, organizes itself around the notion of disproportionate burdens, the idea that while we'll find pollution everywhere, we in fact will find it specifically in a few choice places, and they're usually inhabited by the poor, the racialized, and the marginalized. Reserves, as you know, have tended to be located on substandard lands and are now too often contaminated and downwind or downstream of heavy industrial development or resource projects. At the same time, the stark reality is that Aboriginal people have not benefited from the resource development, even when it's occurred on their lands or traditional territories. And in fact, this is now becoming part of the mainstream policy debate around Idle No More, that resource wealth and Aboriginal lands go hand in hand in this country. So an environmental justice lens prompts us to ask why some people and communities are expected in the context of a national energy strategy to endure higher degrees of risk with little expectation of benefit than others. So in the paper, I look in detail at the NEB decision on the Phase 1 of the 9-line reversal application, and I don't have time to do that here, but I'll tell you what I concluded. That is that the communities downstream of the tar sands operations, whether we're talking about extraction or refining, are expected to bear the costs of those projects even when they stand to gain no benefits from them proceeding. And startlingly, I can't, why I have that in there. The analysis demonstrates that, in fact, there is no regulatory framework in Canada that could meaningfully conduct that type of analysis. So now that the NEB has been completely stripped down, we're left with a very superficial consideration of adverse environmental effects, narrowly construed, and a national interest assessment that is entirely in the hands of the federal cabinet and is confined to a consideration of the sharing of benefits, completely ignoring the issue of the sharing of costs. So we hear the main opponents of the tar sands expansion talking primarily about the risks of oil spills and the expected increases in greenhouse gases. The local environmental justice impacts of tar sands extraction are increasingly being brought into the debate by Indigenous voices. And these voices have resonance because they open up possibilities for a new brand of resistance. In particular, Indigenous opposition to tar sands pipelines is now often expressed in the language of intergenerational equity. Oh, I forgot to show you this. We did that already. Right, so the Indigenous activists are increasingly coming to this debate and bringing the language of intergenerational equity, not only with respect to climate change, so in an extraction type of sense, but also in a sense of downstream of the refining and the impacts that come with that. Okay, so Harvey acknowledges that there's, and I'm moving into part 3 now, where I'm going to return to the networked infrastructure literature to tell you what I think this all means. Harvey acknowledges there's a certain ambiguity in the term spatial fix. So to employ it in the sense that I introduced in part 1, the fix refers to the way that capital is locked up and committed to a particular physical form for a certain period of time. Specific industrial actors benefit from this effort to fix space in immovable physical infrastructures of transport like pipelines because it helps them to cement their interests and their advantages over competitors over time. But the attempt to fix space in a pipeline here is also a telling example of Harvey's notion of the spatial fix in a second sense. It represents a mode of geographical expansion quite typical for contemporary capitalism, and that is the search for new markets. As Natural Resources Minister Joe Oliver has stated, quote, "We must absolutely be able to transport the resources to tidewater, and to do that we need to get the infrastructure built." In this way, the spatial fix refers to what the capitalists in the tar sands are hoping to achieve, and that is a quick fix or solution for their problems of overaccumulation. The progress of accumulation depends on the existence of a market to absorb the increasing quantities of commodities produced, according to Harvey. The glut of tar sands crude stranded inline is a serious barrier to the progress of accumulation, to the point that it's now regarded as a crisis. The solution to solving periodic crises of overaccumulation, according to Harvey, is to construct a new plane of effective demand, or in the neoliberal language of today's economists, a quote, security of demand, which in this example means geographic expansion and new and emerging markets in Asia. So there's a tension between Harvey's two kinds of fixes. The first, which is about the tying up and pinning down of large amounts of capital in place, and the second, which is the perpetual act of seeking to resolve the crisis tendencies of capitalism or overaccumulation through the production of space, absorbing surpluses of resources, raw materials, or nature, finding new reserve armies of cheap labor, or by seeking new markets. Both are seen in this example, and as Harvey predicts, the two kinds of fixes collide to form a potentially serious contradiction. In the coast-to-coast pipeline example, the drive of some actors to achieve a spatial fix in order to cement their own interests retrenches the infrastructure of fossil capitalism and requires expansion in the tar sands to justify the sunk costs. The expansion then fuels the need for more outlets and new markets, which in turn increases demand for fossil fuels and further justifies expansion. Redford's budget crisis, apparently caused by the price differential, does not prompt us to say slow down, but simply find new markets. The pipeline's profitability depends on an expansionary pattern in the global flows of crude oil. If the flows fail to materialize, then the fixed capital stands to be devalued and lost. In other words, once the pipelines are in place, their existence justifies the continued expansion in the tar sands and contributes to the sense of inevitability that surrounds our energy path. So pipelines are enduring, but they do not fix space forever, as the Line 9 reversal clearly shows. The degree of permanence, in fact, varies, and capital will always be seeking new ways and a new spatial fix. There are end-arounds and temporary solutions to counteract the current crisis of accumulation. And I think the dramatic increase in the use of rail to move crude is a good example. In fact, the rush to move oil onto rail cars was recently described as a, quote, giddy procession of profit. It's also highly risky. As pipelines get caught up in public concerns around environmental impacts, the rail cars are sidestepping this obstacle, even as they're known to present a higher incidence of spills. So this strategic jockeying for position by industry players makes it clear that the category of capital deployed in Harvey's theory of the spatial fix needs to be disaggregated. in order to account adequately for the degree to which specific industrial actors stand to gain and lose from specific spatial configurations of privately owned infrastructure. The economics of pipelines results in a strong first-in-place advantage. The fixed nature of the infrastructure locks in value that accrues to particular players over time, and it's held in place by long-term contractual relationships with the shippers. But their competitors will always be seeking another fix, more to their own strategic benefit. Each fix is enduring, with real consequences for particular peoples and places, but it is also ultimately temporary. And finally, there are significant economies of scale associated with pipeline throughput that's concentrated into a single large pipeline. But from a national policy perspective, this also invites risks associated with the pipeline's potential disruption. And this brings me to my last topic. So just prior to last week's compromise, the Idle No More movement had articulated a strategy of explicitly targeting critical infrastructure, and in some cases tied those actions to opposition to the federal government's responsible resource development agenda. The threat to shut down Highway 63, for example, between Fort McMurray and Edmonton, the lifeblood of the tar sands, is a very strong example. But the event that cemented the centrality of networked infrastructure to the contemporary debates and exposed the sudden vulnerability of the infrastructure of fossil capitalism, for me, was the recent blockade of the CN rail line in Amjanong. Amjanong, as you know, is on the periphery. It is not sheltered from the environmental costs of the production of energy products, plastics, and resins. The impact of the refineries and petrochemical plants there is by now well documented. And a year ago, though, which was the last time I was there, I would never have imagined that the youth would have staged this blockade. So what is the significance of it? Grassroots indigenous resistance under the banner of Idle No More threatens to intensify and manifest in direct action by Native protesters specifically targeting the infrastructure of fossil capitalism. As the approvals for the proposed outlets for tar sands crude become increasingly uncertain, the producers turn to rail, which is essentially another spatial fix, but it's one that's highly vulnerable to disruption by those disenfranchised by the emerging energy vision for Canada. A certain vulnerability accompanies the flow of great quantities of energy along narrow channels. In a parallel to how Timothy Mitchell demonstrated the way that trade unions of coal miners garnered political power historically by disrupting the movement of energy at critical junctions in these channels, I think we should expect to see over the coming years that Indigenous struggle for greater control over resources and lands will shape the flows of commodified nature between core and periphery and across the various regions of this country. Thank you. So I have some time for questions.
So I'm just going to get the microphone, Dayna.
Sure.
Even though it's unamplifying, we are recording for use. I think we're posting it recently too. So, questions?
How thoroughly are the pipelines, not sure what the right word is, but patrolled? Railways, I know, like an inspector goes over the whole line every day. Mm-hmm. What is there an equivalent frequent inspection of these pipelines? Do you know?
I don't know too much in detail about that. I know that the various pipeline proposals that have come forward recently have included sort of ramped up plans by the pipeline companies to do more inspections and further safety checks than they have done in the past. I don't know how often it is compared with rail, for example.
If they're offering to do more, suggesting they think they're not doing enough now.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting question about the safety in terms of a reversed flow of a pipeline, for example, as well. There's quite a few claims that reversing the flow actually increases the risk of rupture of a pipeline. This is hotly contested. Also, the claim that's been very prominent in the Keystone Plan that that dilbit, diluted bitumen traveling by pipeline, is more likely to cause a rupture than conventional oil is also recently been contested in the US with studies.
Other questions? Oh, if you leave that on the table, I've got another one. Yours?
I don't think so.
She's amplified. Just put it down somewhere right at the end.
So Dayna, you talked a few times about some sort of national strategy, and the fact that we don't have one in place is sort of kind of leading to, or sort of exacerbating the problems that we're seeing here. And I was just wondering if you could comment on what do you see such a strategy sort of looking like, and how would that be helpful if the strategy that was in place is maybe you know, not so strict? And I'm thinking of the government that we have in power now and the type of regime that they would be likely to craft, and would that be meaningful? Would that be helpful?
Oh, that's a good question. I've thought a little bit about this. You're right that you know, simply having a national energy strategy in place according to the vision of the federal government we have now is probably not going to answer my concerns about this, right? But a regulatory framework potentially could be. And I think where I really want to go with this is to develop the idea that there should be a regulatory framework for dealing with the trade-offs, okay? And for setting up a possibility that communities could in fact agree to host refineries that would process tar sands crude in exchange for regulatory benefits, let's call them, okay? So the example I've been thinking about is with respect to benzene. Benzene is a chemical that's released from refineries in what they call fugitive emissions, right? They're not allowed to, but it's a known sort of byproduct of refining, and it sort of leaks out all over the place. Benzene is a terribly dangerous thing to breathe. It's proven to be linked with the incidence of childhood leukemia, for example. And there was a time in Montreal, in Quebec, where there was a pilot project instituted in the 90s where the Canadian Council of Ministries of the Environment came up with a pilot project that could, whereby refiners could voluntarily agree to reduce their emissions of benzene. And the refinery in Montreal did amazingly well at this, like with an 85% reduction in benzene levels, for example. And following that, the city of Montreal enacted a bylaw which required refiners to meet those standards in terms of benzene, and they also took action on sulfur dioxide, which causes respiratory problems. So I've had this exchange, for example, with Mike Bradley before. When Keystone was initially rejected, Mike Bradley went out, he's the mayor of Sarnia, in the media and in the Sarnia Observer, basically vying for the Keystone oil, saying, we don't need Keystone, actually, send it here. We've got the refining capacity, we can do it. And I tried to challenge Bradley to take on some kind of bylaw, or something that would say, we understand that there's costs associated with doing this. We want to trade them against the benefits to our community, and we're willing to go out there and have sort of a really strict regulatory regime that can mitigate some of these costs in exchange for agreeing to do this. And of course, well, Bradley's answer was quite predictable. There has to be a level playing field. It would have to be across the whole province. We're not going to just do it here in Sarnia. But so there are opportunities there. I think that if there was a venue to assess the costs and benefits and how they fall on particular places, specifically how the benefits don't accrue to the same folks who are bearing the burdens, then we might be able to come up with some places where we're willing to give a little bit from a regulatory perspective, which would give people more of a sense that that they're being heard on this, you know, that there actually is an assessment of the impacts on them, and that they have some agency in kind of weighing those risks and deciding whether or not the trade-off is worth it. I think that lack of agency in terms of the trade-offs is what's giving rise to this real growing frustration.
I think Aaron has the next question. I'll just bring up the microphone.
Hi, Dayna. Thanks for that. You mentioned in your talk, I know this wasn't your focus, but and I just wanted to ask about that. And I wanted to ask if you have a sense of the proposed financing for each of the particular projects. Pierre has this great project on the equator principles, and it's so interesting to me that in the last iteration that came over the summer, the equator principles adopts the idea of free, prior, informed consent as a precondition to lending. So in that sense, you have this sort of private sector initiative where the safeguards actually exceed the safeguards that are provided by the state, which is just mind-blowing.
No, I mean, that's really interesting to me. I haven't looked into the financing of the pipeline proposals at all, and in fact, it's something I do want to go to next, as well as the, if I can get any information on them, the contractual relationships between the shippers and the producers. But the question of free, prior, and informed consent is so interesting because there was a focus section in the Globe, I forget when it was, October, November last year, where they were comparing the organizing of some Latin American indigenous people against mining projects with some of the indigenous folks in, I think it was Fort McKay. And they were talking about this language of free, prior, and informed consent and pointing out places and times at which Enbridge and Suncor and lots of these other folks will go in front of particular audiences and use language that sounds like we want to be welcomed by that. We want communities that want us and that kind of thing. But the language of consent never makes it into those statements, right? And so there's something key about that. And I think in the Canadian context, it's probably exceptionally important. The thing to know about the Northern Gateway that lots of people find very significant is the fact that over half of the proposed route of Northern Gateway crosses unceded territories in BC, right? So Gordon Christie, for example, has written indicating that he thinks there is a possibility for lots of resistance, not just constitutional challenges, injunctions, direct action, et cetera, but also he's highlighted the claims of several groups, including the Yinka Dene Alliance, which is making a specific claim in Indigenous law. It's saying the National Energy Board does not have the authority to approve a pipeline over this territory. It's not a rights claim, right? It's not a title claim. It's just like, no, not here. Yeah, yeah.
Other questions? Oh, you got mic right there if you can grab it.
I just had a question building off the benefits that you were talking about earlier, and a question of whether that's a political will issue or whether with dealing with Alberta crude, if that's actually kind of a physical, practical limit to what you can do, and whether the case with the benzene in Montreal was dealing with much crude at all.
Certainly, well, I don't know much about the technicalities of the differences between refining conventional crude and the bitumen, or upgrading and then refining. Sulfur is a key problem, I think. And you know, there's plenty of evidence in the environmental health literature about the additional detrimental impacts on air quality of refining heavier crudes. I think there's also some indications that process changes, emissions controls, and various kind of physical barriers and stuff can actually reduce those emissions. The industry, of course, doesn't like to talk about those very much because they cost a lot and in some cases are very easy, technically easy and expensive. But I would like to see more discussion of that, for sure.
Dayna, my question, I think, builds a little on Aaron's just now. So if one looks for different hooks, to get this under control, then one has to now be relatively creative by combining, you know, what do we know in terms of hard law, what do we do in terms of administrative law, environmental law is all of these things together, then there is maybe investment law, there is corporate law. Now, it's almost by chance that students would learn how to, you know, gain this expertise to combine these different modes. I'm, as you know, interested in deducing what we should learn for how to teach them if they don't end up taking your seminar, right? So this is a very opportune moment to combine these different strategies, and it's amazingly practical, but it's only going to be successful if it's also theoretical, which means how do lawyers actually think about future generations? You know, what do we do with this photo that you showed us, the child, you know, with that cardboard? So they come from all these different angles, but only if they happen to take this highly specialized seminar would they know that they now have to think in those ways, that they have to combine these different methodologies and approaches. And if students don't take clinical legal education, or even if they do, but they do it only in one area, I wonder just what kind of lessons we could draw from scenarios such as those of how to make sure that students know that lawyering today would involve such cases.
I think it's a really good point. I mean, part of what I determined early on in this project is that a sort of strict or narrow legal or regulatory approach to this problem was not interesting or useful at all, right? We could look at what the changes to the NEB Act have done, but doesn't illuminate any of this. It doesn't tell us why this race is. This is why I find the critical geography literature has been productive for me. It couldn't let me unpack why the race, right? Why is it going on? How is it going on outside of a regulatory framework, outside of a strategy? You know, why is it that we don't have a system in place to weigh these costs and benefits? So you're right that a narrow lens on it it's not satisfying, it can't answer it. I don't know how to, I mean, I think the really obvious answer in terms of law school teaching is to try and organize teaching around particular case studies or like little factual modules that you force students to bring different sources of information into, whether it's geography, economics, law, politics, etc. I think that can help a little bit, but of course it's also, anybody who does interdisciplinary work knows this, it's like, it's terrifying, right? Because you're, like on the way on the train today, I was thinking to myself, if somebody was tweeting this event, it would be legal scholar dabbles in David Harvey, right? Like it's embarrassing, and I would think, yeah, that's fully justified, right? But that's the fear, right? That if you know all those things, you don't know enough about any of them to come off with credibility or authority. That's inspiring, I know.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, I think that's it, Dayna. Thank you very much. That was just absolutely fascinating.